A merchant in a marketplace somewhere in the Roman world picks up a wax tablet. A debt has just been paid in full, every coin, every denarius, settled. He takes his stylus and presses a single word across the bill. One word. A word that meant the account was closed. Nothing left owed. Nothing left to collect. You won't know that word yet, but hold on to it. Because in a few minutes, on a hill outside Jerusalem, that exact word is going to be the last thing a dying man ever says, and it's going to mean something far bigger than a paid invoice. Now picture this instead. It is noon, not midnight, noon, and the sky over Jerusalem has gone black. Not cloudy, not stormy, black, in the middle of the day, for 3 hours straight, while a man hangs nailed to a wooden beam. On a hill called Golgotha, the place of the skull. You can hear the soldiers below, bored, playing a dice game for the one thing he owns, his robe. You can hear the crowd, some weeping, some mocking, none of them knowing what they're actually watching. And somewhere in that crowd stands a woman who carried this man in her own body 33 years earlier, and now she's watching him die in hers. This is the moment most people think they understand. A man was executed. It was cruel. It was unjust. It was sad. But here's what almost nobody puts together. That's only one trial. This is not a story about a man losing. This is not a story about Rome winning a case it had already decided before the trial even started. This is not a story about an execution that went exactly as planned by the men running it. Because at the very same hour, on the very same hill, 2 other trials were happening. Trials no camera could film. Trials no soldier standing guard even knew were underway. One was a courtroom. One was a battlefield. And both of them were being decided in the same 6 hours as the one everyone could see. You're about to watch all 3 unfold side by side. The one with nails and soldiers and a darkened sky. The one with a debt and a verdict and a substitution, and the one with rulers and powers who thought they had already won. Stay with me, because by the end, that word stamped on a paid Roman bill is going to come back. And when it does, you'll understand exactly why a dying man would choose it as his very last sentence. Let's start with the trial you could actually see. The one with witnesses. The one Rome was proud of. It begins earlier that morning, on a road leading out of the city, where a man named Simon is walking in from the countryside. He's not from Jerusalem. He's from Cyrene, a city on the coast of North Africa, hundreds of miles away. A Jewish pilgrim who has traveled a long distance for Passover, expecting nothing more dramatic than a feast with his family. Instead, Roman soldiers grab him out of the crowd. You can imagine the confusion on his face. He has done nothing. He knows none of these people. And yet a wooden beam, heavy, splintered, soaked with someone else's blood, is shoved onto his shoulders, and he is told to carry it. Not asked, told. Here's what almost nobody mentions about Simon. He didn't volunteer. He wasn't a disciple. He was a bystander who got swept into the most important 6 hours in human history simply because he happened to be walking down the wrong road at the wrong time. Or, if you believe what Simon's own family later believed, the exact right road at the exact right time. Because according to the Gospel of Mark, this man had 2 sons. Their names were Alexander and Rufus. And Mark mentions them by name as if his readers would already know who they were. Meaning that somewhere in the early church, these 2 sons grew up and became known. An ordinary man, pulled out of a crowd to carry a stranger's cross, ends up with sons who carry something else entirely. That's story 1. Personal stakes. One man, one beam, one road he didn't choose. Now widen the lens. A few hours earlier, in a courtyard not far away, a Roman governor named Pontius Pilate is standing in front of a crowd that is getting louder by the minute. Pilate has already questioned the prisoner in front of him. He's already said, more than once, that he finds no legal basis for execution. By Roman law, this trial should already be over. But the crowd isn't interested in Roman law. They're interested in blood. Pilate offers them a choice. A custom at Passover, releasing one prisoner. On one side, Jesus. On the other, a man named Barabbas. A convicted insurrectionist, a man with actual blood already on his hands. And the crowd chooses Barabbas. Think about what that means. The guilty man walks free. The innocent man is condemned. Pilate, a man with the actual legal power to stop this, calls for water instead. He washes his hands in front of everyone and says the words are not his fault, that he is innocent of this blood. But here's what most people miss about that moment. Washing your hands doesn't end a trial. It just means you've decided not to be the one who carries the verdict, even though you're the one signing it. That's story 2. Public stakes. A governor with the power to stop an injustice, choosing instead to wash his hands of it. And now the third story, the quiet one, the one most people walk straight past without noticing. After the nails go in, after the cross is lifted upright on the hill, the soldiers below sit down to wait. Crucifixion was slow. It could take hours, sometimes days. So while a man hung above them, struggling for every breath, the soldiers did what bored men do. They gambled. They took the one possession he had left, his robe, and instead of tearing it into 4 pieces to split evenly, they noticed it was woven without a seam, too valuable to ruin. So they rolled dice for it instead. Here's the part nobody tells you. 700 years before that day, a writer of Hebrew poetry, a king, in fact, wrote down a sentence describing exactly that scene. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Psalm 22, verse 18. Written centuries before crucifixion even existed as a form of execution. And here are Roman soldiers, who have never read a word of Hebrew scripture, who have no idea they're being watched by history, acting out a sentence written down for them in advance, not because anyone told them to, but because that's simply what bored soldiers did at executions. You don't need to believe in anything supernatural to find that strange. The Hebrew word for this kind of detailed prediction, fulfilled centuries later by people who never read it, is sometimes translated as mofet, a sign, a wonder, something pointing past itself to a bigger pattern. 3 stories, 3 angles on the same trial. A pilgrim forced to carry a beam he never asked for. A governor who had the power to stop an execution and chose to wash his hands instead. And soldiers gambling for fabric while fulfilling a prophecy older than the empire they served. This is the visible trial. The one with a courtroom, a crowd, a verdict, and a cross. But there's a second trial happening at the very same hour, one with no crowd, no witnesses, and a verdict far bigger than anything Rome had jurisdiction to decide. That's the trial you could see. Nails, soldiers, a crowd, a governor washing his hands. But there's a second trial happening at the exact same hour, in a courtroom no human eye could ever witness. A legal case with a verdict that would matter more than anything Pilate ever signed. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If this is the first time you've heard the cross described as 3 trials happening at once, hit subscribe. Because we're about to go somewhere most Bible explainers never take you. And drop a comment telling me which trial you think matters most. I'll read every one. Now, let's go into the courtroom you can't see. A few hours before any of this happened, in a different building entirely, a man named Caiaphas thought he had already won. Caiaphas was the high priest. He had spent months, maybe years, looking for a way to deal with the man from Nazareth who kept drawing crowds, kept healing people in public, kept saying things that sounded uncomfortably close to a claim no human being should ever make. So when the chance finally came, a midnight arrest, a rushed hearing, false witnesses who couldn't even agree with each other, Caiaphas pushed it through anyway. By morning, he had what he wanted. A guilty verdict. A case closed. Here's what Caiaphas never saw coming. His trial wasn't the real one. There was another courtroom entirely, and it wasn't in Jerusalem. It wasn't built by human hands. And Caiaphas, for all his religious authority, had absolutely no jurisdiction in it. In that courtroom, the question being decided wasn't whether Jesus had broken Jewish law or Roman law. The question was older and heavier than that. It was about you. About a debt every human being owes and cannot pay. A debt the Bible calls sin. Not a metaphor. Not a feeling of guilt. An actual record, an actual account, with your name on it. Paul, writing decades later to a church in a city called Colossae, describes this debt using a word that would have made every reader in the ancient world flinch, a word for a legal document. He calls it a certificate of debt, a record of everything stacked against you, with all its legal demands. And then he says something almost impossible to picture. God took that certificate, your certificate, and nailed it to the cross. Sit with that image for a second. Not the man, the debt, nailed to the wood alongside him. This is where the second trial gets its verdict. Because in any courtroom, a debt has to be paid by someone. Either the guilty party pays it themselves, or someone else steps in and pays it for them. And here's the part that should stop you cold. The man hanging on that cross hadn't broken any law. Pilate said it. Even the soldiers who executed him said it later. He was, by every legal definition available, innocent. So how does an innocent man end up paying a debt that was never his? Paul answers that question too, in a letter to a different church, in a sentence so short it's almost easy to read past it. He made him to be sin, the one who knew no sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God. Read that again, slowly. The one person in the entire trial who owed nothing was the one who paid everything. Not because the court made a mistake, because he chose to stand in the place where the debt was due. This is not a story about a man losing his case. This is not a story about an innocent man being mistaken for a guilty one. This is a story about a judge who was also the defendant, choosing to pay a fine he never owed, so that the people who did owe it could walk out of the courtroom free. You need to understand. This isn't poetic language stretched to sound dramatic. The legal vocabulary in the original Greek text is precise, almost clinical. It reads like something out of an actual courtroom transcript, not a campfire story. Substitution, debt, payment, verdict. These are legal words, chosen on purpose, by writers who wanted you to understand this as a real transaction, not just a tragic death. But it gets stranger. Because while Caiaphas was congratulating himself on a guilty verdict he thought he'd won that morning, and while this second, invisible trial was reaching its own far larger verdict at the very same hour, a third trial was happening too. One that had nothing to do with debts or courtrooms at all. One that was being fought not with gavels, but with powers Caiaphas didn't even believe existed. There's a third trial, and this one wasn't being fought with gavels, certificates, or legal verdicts. This one was being fought with thrones. Paul describes it in the same letter where he mentioned the certificate of debt, but here he's no longer talking about courtrooms. He's talking about armies. He writes that on the cross, God disarmed the rulers and authorities, unseen powers, spiritual forces of darkness operating behind the visible world, and made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. Think about how strange that sentence is. The cross wasn't just where Jesus lost his life. According to Paul, it's where unseen powers lost a war they thought they'd already won. Here's the trap they walked into. For centuries, these powers had worked in the shadows, behind empires, behind corrupt courts, behind crowds that could be turned in an instant from worship to crucify him. And on this day, they finally got what looked like total victory. The healer was dead. The miracle worker was silenced. The one who claimed to be God's own son was nailed to Roman wood and left to die in front of a mocking crowd for about 3 hours. It must have looked, in every unseen throne room of darkness, like the war was over. Now go back to the sky. It's the 9th hour. 3 hours of darkness over the land. And from the cross, in the language he actually spoke, not formal Hebrew, but the everyday Aramaic of the street and the home, Jesus cries out the opening line of an ancient Hebrew poem. Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? You need to hear how loaded that line really is. It's not a man losing faith in his final moment. It's the first line of Psalm 22, a poem written 1,000 years earlier that describes, in disturbing detail, a man's hands and feet pierced, his bones out of joint, people staring and gambling for his clothing. The very prophecy the soldiers had unknowingly fulfilled below him. He's not quoting it by accident. He's calling out the title of the very chapter he is, at that exact moment, living out in front of everyone. And then, at the very instant his body gives out, at the very moment the visible trial reaches its execution, and the invisible trial reaches its verdict, something happens that no soldier ordered and no priest expected. In the temple, less than a mile away, there's a curtain, 60 feet tall, by some ancient descriptions, thick enough that historians say it would have taken horses pulling in opposite directions to tear it. This curtain separated ordinary worshippers from the one room in the entire building where God's presence was said to dwell. No one was allowed past it except a single priest, once a year, and even then, only with blood in his hands. At the moment Jesus dies, that curtain tears, not from the bottom, the way a man with a knife might tear it. From the top, straight down. You don't get to do that by accident. And you don't get to do that by sneaking in with a blade while a guard isn't looking. A curtain that thick, torn top to bottom. In the same instant a man 3 hours walk away takes his last breath. That's not coincidence. That's a verdict, delivered in fabric. The legal trial is closed. The way to God's presence, blocked for over 1,000 years, is open. And then comes the word. Remember the merchant from the very beginning. Remember the wax tablet, the paid bill, the single word stamped across it to mark the debt as closed. That word, in the Greek of the 1st century, was Tetelestai. It's the same word Jesus says next. It is finished. Most people hear that phrase as exhaustion, as a dying man giving up. But Tetelestai was a business word before it was ever a religious one. Archaeologists have found it stamped across actual 1st century receipts, tax bills, loan agreements, marking them paid in full. Nothing left owed. Nothing left to collect. When a Roman shopkeeper stamped Tetelestai across an invoice, it meant the account was closed for good. That is the word Jesus chooses as his last sentence. Not "I'm finished." Not "it's over." Tetelestai. Paid in full. The certificate of debt Paul described, your certificate, gets the very same word stamped across it, at the very same hour, by the very same man. Below the cross, a Roman centurion has watched executions before. He's hardened to it. That's the job. He's seen the dark sky, heard the cry in Aramaic, watched the curtain tear in the temple in the distance, and something in him breaks open. He says the one sentence none of his commanding officers would ever want recorded. Truly, this was the Son of God. A career soldier of the empire that just executed him says it out loud, in public, at the foot of the cross. This is not a story about Rome winning. This is not a story about Caiaphas closing his case. This is not a story about powers of darkness celebrating a victory. This is a story about 3 trials reaching one verdict. At 1 hour, on one hill, and every single one of them ending the exact same way. Paid in full. So what do you actually do with all of that? Here's the first thing to take with you. Calvary was never just one event. It was 3 trials, in 3 different realms, all reaching their verdict in the same 6 hours. A visible one with nails and soldiers, an invisible one with debts and certificates, and a cosmic one with rulers and powers who thought they'd already won. You can't fully understand the cross by only looking at one of those 3. You have to see all 3 at once, happening together, on purpose. Here's the second thing. That certificate of debt Paul described, the one nailed to the cross, had your name on it. Not a generic name. Not humanity in the abstract. Yours. Every failure you've ever tried to outrun. Every shame you've ever hidden. Every debt you knew you could never pay back on your own. Paul says it was nailed to that wood, stamped, and closed. You weren't a bystander to what happened at Calvary. You were the reason the trial existed in the first place. And here's the third thing, the one I want you to actually sit with. The same word stamped on a paid Roman invoice. 2,000 years ago is the same word a dying man chose as his very last sentence, on your behalf, before he ever knew your name. Tetelestai. Paid in full. Not almost finished. Not payment pending. Finished. You don't know what you think you owe. You don't have to keep working to settle an account that was already closed at the 9th hour. On a hill called the Place of the Skull, by the only man in history with the authority to close it. So here's my question for you, and I actually want to know the answer. Out of the 3 trials we walked through today, the visible one, the legal one, or the cosmic one, which one hit you the hardest? Tell me below. I read every comment. Because here's the truth underneath all 3 trials. A debt was paid that you didn't pay. A war was won that you didn't fight. And a word was spoken over your life 2,000 years before you were even born. Paid in full.